We will have the conversations that few are prepared to have, and more importantly, conversations centered on rationality. Subscribe now to listen to Rational Voices with Sunil. Delighted to have Adam Swart with us today, who is the founder of Crowds on Demand. Adam, how are you?
Excellent, Sunil. Thanks so much for having me on your program.
Thanks for joining. For those who are unaware, what is Crowds on Demand, and how did you build this all up?
So, Crowds on Demand is the largest protest firm in the United States. We have been around for about 13 years at this point. Started the company when I was in college, and we've grown it since then. Our concept is based on the First Amendment principle of free expression and freedom of speech. So, we only engage in First Amendment sanctioned activities. That's to say, only peaceful, law-abiding protests, right? We don't affiliate with anything that doesn't fall in that grounds. And then the other thing that we do is, PR stunts, product launches, kind of splashy headline generating publicity events. So, um, we got started when I was in college and I worked on political campaigns and saw such a huge need for drawing attendees to events and even more so to protests. And I always say this, but the same speech has a very different context depending on how many people are in the audience. Imagine Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech delivered to 10 people. It wouldn't have had that same resonance, right? So the context is everything. The difference between 5 people showing up to protest and 1,000 people showing up to protest, it's huge. It's contextual. So we built this up and kind of grew from that basis. And one of my kind of priorities as we get into this age is to make sure that everyone who participates in our events, not necessarily our marketing events, but our advocacy events, are truly passionate about the cause that they are espousing. So we don't want to pay people for their views. We want to pay people for their time in expressing their views. So just as a talk show host gets paid to express their views, just as a conservative lawyer, a liberal lawyer would get paid for advocating for clients who presumably generally fit that political persuasion, that's exactly how it works with us. So we want to make sure that the people that work for us really believe it.
Right. And how did this all start? You mentioned you started in college. Was there a specific event that you saw happen? Was there a sort of a point where you thought this is clearly something that's needed in the market? How did it all begin?
Well, yeah. So, well, I worked for a lot of campaigns, so this was mostly on the Democratic Party side. Though I definitely consider myself an independent now. I did a lot of these. I was kind of in charge at the time of all the Southern California kind of student activities for the Democratic side. And the people running these campaigns were at the time sort of figures out of the 60s. They were in college in the 1960s when you could turn out 10,000 people in a day, on the quad because you didn't have as much competing activities. There's really a spirit of activism. I mean, I guess I would argue a lot of those people weren't really out there for passion, but they were trying to get laid and smoke pot. But regardless, the point stands that they would basically be like, "Hey, Adam, get us like 10,000 students out there. If you have to, you can get free pizza." And I'm like, guys, it's not quite that easy anymore. So part of it was adjusting to this kind of an era of greater apathy where there was there's still the need to draw people, but not necessarily the ability to do so easily. So I got to thinking, okay, this is LA. There are a ton of out of work people, actors, whatever, who could be put to work in doing all of that. So that's basically how it started.
Wow, that's amazing to think what how you came up with that strategy like that. And what I'm guessing in LA, like you mentioned, there's a lot of people not working. This situation maybe not so good in that state. Um, was this something that you saw specifically for the Republicans, Democrats, or was this just something that you thought cross-party, this is a business model that will work regardless of which side of the fence you sit on?
Oh, I don't think it has anything to do with political party because I think there's a need for it on both sides. And of course, both parties try to sort of accuse, and I say it in quotation marks, the other side of using paid demonstrators. And I say put accuse in quotation marks because there's this implication that it's a bad thing when it's no different from advertising or any other strategy where you're using money to amplify your message. I think one mistake people make about protesting, Sunil, is that they assume protests are a perfect polling on how people think. So if 200 people show up in favor of an issue and 50 people show up against an issue, there's this idea of, oh, well, people must be in favor of the issue 4-1. Well, that's not really how it works. A protest is a way to amplify your message, right? Just like advertising, right? If you advertise for the Super Bowl, you spend several $1,000,000, right? What are you getting for that advertising? You're making sure that millions of people see your message.
Yeah.
Protest accomplishes the same thing, whether it's a small protest that gets in the local news or a giant protest that makes national headlines. Protest is a way to draw attention to the fact that here's here's my concerns. So I think that's where it's effective, and I think where people are kind of mad at the concept of paid protesting is the flawed assumption that protest in any way reflects public sentiment. It doesn't, and it never has.
And I think there's so many people listening in the UK that will 100% relate to this. There's so many examples of where protests were quite bad in certain situations in the UK, and the polling and all that, the results did not equal what the protests and all that was going on. Is this something that is specific to US, what your business does, or is it global?
We work selectively internationally. We're primarily in the United States, and part of it is because my friends in the UK will know you guys don't have freedom of speech over there. I love the UK. I have family over there, but you don't have true freedom of speech. I mean, I got slammed on Twitter for saying this several months ago, but the Crown Prosecution Service was basically saying that you would be arrested for incitement, and the definition of incitement was very sketchy. Like my definition of an incitement, if you say go to this hotel and burn it down,
Yeah.
okay, fine, that is incitement. But if you're saying I'm really upset with migrants in this country, right? I mean, put whether that's an offensive viewpoint or not. It doesn't matter. I mean, offensive viewpoints should be taken. And then someone else does something bad and does commits a hate crime. Now you're held accountable and said, "Oh, well, you incited that." Well, and then you go to jail. I mean, it's insane. The person who burns the building should go to jail. I mean, it's very un-American. But so you have to consider that when we're working abroad, we have to deal with sort of the laws of different countries, flawed as they may be. And the way that I see it is that we definitely will do a lot of like publicity stunts or publicity events abroad, but we tend not to do so much in terms of the advocacy and protest, just because a lot of countries have laws like that that are just very hard to navigate. And in America, at least historically, we have pretty solid protections for freedom of expression, as we should.
Yeah, that's well documented. The UK, you're completely correct, doesn't have freedom of speech anymore, in the same way that the US has nowhere near. And I think the UK current or last year had more arrests from social media than Russia, and so it is heading down a pretty dark path when it comes to freedom of speech. In terms of the US, there was a big debate in the UK, and I'm sure in the US as well, with the election last year where there was this kind of feeling, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was this kind of feeling that had Kamala Harris won, that maybe there would be restrictions on freedom of speech, or maybe there would be some caveats to it. Is that, would you say that's a fair response, a fair feeling?
My opinion is I think both the right and the left have become less principled in the idea of freedom of speech, and I condemn it whoever is restricting free speech. So I mean it's impossible to predict the hypothetical. Certainly the Biden administration cracked down on free speech. For example, a lot of the parents who were speaking out at school board meetings in the US, this was a big thing around the mask mandates. Again, legitimate debate, but a lot of parents that were saying, hey, we don't want our kids taught about, racism when they're like 5 years old, or they don't want them to make them wear the mask. Then basically the Department of Justice was investigating these parents. I mean, this is the federal Department of Justice, which was kind of insane, right? But conversely, I have to say I'm not a fan of the Trump administration's deporting students who kind of express views that they don't like. So I think you're seeing too much restriction on freedom of speech from both sides. And what I tell my conservative friends is that, do you really want, imagine if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right, becomes the leader of the United States in 3 years. Do you want to give her those powers to deport people who she doesn't agree with? I mean, maybe she'll make a deal with Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela to deport right wing people to Venezuela. So I'm very wary of any kind of precedent of restricting freedom of speech. And so much of this idea of, oh, this is inciting, this is hate speech, comes down to this is speech I don't like, this is speech you don't like. There's a reason why the ACLU defended the right of neo Nazis to protest in a Jewish community not long after the Holocaust. I mean, probably the most reprehensible form of speech imaginable. And by the way, the lawyers for the ACLU were, I think, mostly Jewish lawyers who did this. Why? Because they said, look, we have to protect the most vile forms of free speech to know that all free speech is protected. And that's historically the American notion, but I think both right and left have abandoned it. And I think we only have to look at the UK to see the direction that will head.
I think that's such a good example because that example just shows by allowing that speech to be heard that you can expose how stupid and how crazy those things are being said. But then if you hide it away, then people may start to question, why is it being hidden away? What's going on? Is there some truth behind it? We can expose it, put it into the light, and destroy the argument. And I think in the UK, unfortunately, we're not able to have much of these kind of debates that you're able to have in America. Has there been and it sounds like there's, regardless of Republican, Democrat, in the last 5, 10 years, there seems to be a change on freedom of speech. Is that fair to say that there's
Yeah.
almost been a decline?
Yeah, unfortunately, because I think, like I said, there is this idea that they want deplatforming. It's basically, and the conservatives historically have been protesting deplatforming, but they've really gone into deplatforming lately too, which I think is they need to really think twice about. Um, because generally the left is a little bit better at deplatforming than the right. So if the deplatforming isn't going to go the way the conservatives think it will, um, but basically, yeah, there has been, because on the from the left wing, there's this idea that certain speech is basically hateful, right? So certain speech is tantamount to violence. So I think you can imagine the kind of speech that they might say is tantamount to violence, right? But the challenge with that is that then when now Trump is in office, he can say, "Oh well, the Palestine speech is tantamount to violence," right? So whereas it's a very dangerous precedent, and people need to be just open to the idea of hearing something that you don't agree with, even if it's very offensive, right? Let's just imagine the most offensive arguments possible. The Holocaust didn't happen, slavery was a good thing, women shouldn't have rights, right? Like these are very offensive concepts that I understand people kind of say, hey, I don't even want to hear this. But if you don't hear this, then you really run the risk of something that is offensive to someone who's bad being stifled. I mean, civil rights was a very offensive concept at one time. The concept of equal rights was an offensive concept that would have been stifled, right? So I also condemn the Trump administration trying to kind of, for example, they're taking out references to gay everywhere. So literally they scrubbed every reference to gay so much that they took out references to the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, right? A major part of American military history, right? So it's like, come on, like the freedom of speech train has to go both ways. It's kind of, I mean, that's kind of insane to say, hey, I understand saying, hey, we feel like LGBT has gotten too much into the culture, but then now we're just scrubbing the word gay like we're in an Orwellian novel, right? So I think there's been way too much from both sides, and both sides need to grow some balls and say I'm okay with having speech that I disagree with.
Yeah, are there Republicans, Democrats who are saying what you're saying in terms of who are pushing back and saying we need more freedom of speech? Because JD Vance gave a speech in Europe a few months ago that was a really big hit in the UK and parts of Europe where he talked about the lack of freedom of speech in Europe and what's going on. Are there is he considered somebody who's more pro freedom of speech, and are there other Democrats or Republicans fighting similar battles?
I don't. I think he needs to do more domestically before he comments on other countries' affairs. I again, I don't. I can't speak to what he is saying in private. Maybe he has issues in private that he isn't talking about, but it doesn't feel like he's standing up for the right of, for example, students who are studying abroad in the United States to have their to speak their point of view, right? Even if you disagree with it. So, I don't necessarily consider him a great free speech advocate, but I am open to being corrected if he decides to be one. But I have not seen him to be one. I think the challenge is, Sunil, is it it's unpopular to be a free speech advocate sometimes because you're standing up for the right of people to say things that are objectively offensive, right? It's easier to kowtow to your base and say, oh, we're going to kick out the students who are chanting kind of anti-Semitic slogans, right? We're going to demand that they be expelled from the colleges, right? It's easier to say, oh, we're going to demand that people who say anything against undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants, they have no place in our school, right? It's less popular to say, hey, we don't agree with this, but we're going to protect the rights. But I think that you're going to have a movement. I mean, you have people, of course, like Bill Maher on the left, right, who have been pretty vocal about it. But I don't think you have enough politicians who are radically standing up for it. Um, and we need to see more.
I'm interested to talk more about crowds on demand in terms of the way it's expanded and how much it's grown over since your days in college. Um, I suppose when did crowds on demand really start to ramp up, if you like? When was the stage where it became the big business, the successful business as it is now? When did this really start to ramp up?
Well, so we started in 2012. Um, Again, mostly concentrating in LA, New York, and a couple markets where there was demand. And we kind of expanded. A lot of it was just due to clients. Um, our clients and prospective clients dictated the expansion because initially we saw it as kind of maybe some politics, maybe some kind of PR, but the kind of business case for it, a lot of clients was said, "Oh no, we need to create huge buzz at a conference, right?" So we would have we expanded that part of the business that way where we got more and more business from startup companies trying to make a buzz or otherwise create a big PR kind of stunt. We initially saw ourselves as a tool for candidates, but actually we don't work with that many candidates, which actually defies what a lot of people think. We work a lot more on the side of issues. So if you're trying to push for one issue or against an issue, that's probably more likely a cause that we'd take on rather than working for a candidate or not. So we're normally trying to push candidates to take stances on issues, right? Or policymakers to adopt certain issues, right? And to take certain stances. So, um, so we kind of expanded over the years based on that demand, and of course based on the fact that our reputation has grown. So a lot of clients that had started with smaller campaigns and seen the success of our work have expanded and grown with us. So that's been a good thing too. We want to see more of that. Um, and we've expanded also to doing kind of going beyond protests and kind of doing a vast array of publicity services. Phone banking, for example, emailing, all kinds of things like that.
So would, that there'd be a certain issue from a candidate, they would call up your business and say, we want 100 protesters outside this building, and you would just effectively go organize
Correct?
the people.
So, and in some cases, they would sort of say, hey, we want to build. In some cases, what happens is we actually build the movement too, in addition to the protest. So, okay, let's just say you want to protest a certain company, right? But maybe you want plausible deniability from the protest. We might build a whole organization around this, whatever issue you're upset about,
Right.
have like an executive director, and then stage the protest from that organization. So it wouldn't be you organizing the protest, it would be this organization that we just created that organizes the protest.
Right. And what would happen, like hypothetically? So if you did that, you've organized this protest, because often, let's say, it gets media attention, they often go into the crowd, let's say, and they ask the crowd questions. Would your the staff that are doing the protest, they would be well equipped to answer
To
that?
answer media, of course. Yeah. So typically in these type of things, sometimes the client has their own people do that, but in most cases we have to have our own people who are good at talking to the media. So part of that is it goes to what I was saying at the beginning of this program, which is we provide people who are actually passionate about the issue and actually have stories about the issue. So if the media comes, they can sincerely speak to why they're there and why they believe in the cause.
Right. And to me, it just sounds phenomenal business. A phenomenal business makes complete sense. Have you had much pushback as an organization? I'm guessing naturally as you get bigger and bigger, you're going to probably attract criticism from somewhere. Have you had much pushback, and what sort of pushback have you got?
Well, in terms of criticism, I think most of it is uninformed. But part of why I've sought to go on a few podcasts and do a bit more media in this past years, there's a lot of misinformation about what we do. So number one, there's kind of false idea that we engage in riots and illegal forms of protest. That's obviously not true. Even if I had no moral qualms about that, like as a business owner, why would I engage in something like that reckless and illegal? It would make no sense. Um, so it's important to clarify that we only engage in peaceful, law abiding protests. And to be clear, I consider blocking off a road without a permit to be not a peaceful protest, right? So just to be clear, if you're blocking people's ability to get to work, like that's not a peaceful protest. No, so that's not the one pushback is that, and that's kind of a false pushback, because it's just not true. The second is kind of I've gotten some kind of pushback on the ethics side of, okay, is it right to pay people to turn out? Well, like I said, the people that we're paying to turn out are people otherwise passionate about the cause. So the way that I look at it is in the UK historically, when we separated from you guys all those years ago, in order to be a member of parliament, you were not compensated for your service, right? So, 250 years ago, the British parliament consisted entirely of the landed gentry, right? Because it was not a professional parliament. You had to already be wealthy in order to be in parliament. So those were the only views that were heard. So I guess my question to people about protest is, do you want the only views to be heard in a public protest to be those who can easily afford to attend protests, right? So, I mean, if you're a hippie with a trust fund, right, you can go to as many protests as you want. If you are someone with a flex job, right, like someone who has maybe works in tech, or, that you can take off time whenever you want or work at your leisure, right? If you don't have kids, right? So, but imagine if you work hourly job, if you have kids who need childcare, right? If you have a 9 to 5 job, right? All of those people are going to make a pretty big sacrifice to attend a protest, right? So is it fair that they have to make a bigger sacrifice? And what I tell people on the right is, because a lot of people on the right are like, oh, well, this doesn't vibe for me. And I say, well, if it doesn't vibe for you, you're going to constantly be outnumbered, because the people on the left are less likely to have kids, more less likely to have a 9 to 5 job, more likely to have a flex job, right? So the left is going to outnumber you every single time because they don't have those same factors. If you're someone with a family 9 to 5 job or hourly job, time is money, right? And you may sincerely want to turn out in favor of your views, but you just simply cannot, right? So we're providing that opportunity for people to actually get paid to express their views that they honestly have, and that benefits the client and that benefits the participants.
That makes total sense. I'm really surprised that from the you have that kind of pushback from the right, because one of the big you kind of alluded to it there. There's always a recurring joke in the UK. A lot of the protests are hippies from trust funds or from people who have really wealthy parts of areas just outside of London. That's typically who people protest in the younger age demographic, and that's always a reoccurring joke in the UK. They're the only ones that protest. But I'm surprised that you have that pushback from right, because you could argue it's just what's the difference of your paid for protest and even advertising. People spend millions and millions on TV, podcasts, advertising, TV advertising, magazines, whatever. And what's if that's they're a problem with your business, then they shouldn't advertise full stop. They should just go door to door knocking or whatever. But I think it's a bit unfair to make that comment.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, and you're exactly right that it's really the same concept of advertising. I mean, I'll just give you two examples of movements in the United States. I'm sure you can think of ones in the UK too. But for example, what I also say about protests is protest gets you awareness, but it doesn't get you traction, right? The protest will make sure people hear of you. So if you think about the Tea Party movement, I don't know whether you remember the Tea Party about 15 years ago. It started with literally like these small demonstrations funded by the Koch brothers and other kind of conservative billionaires in the United States, right? They were out there dressed in like Revolutionary War attire, no offense to the British, but they were dressed like the Tea Party patriots, right? And they were out there Fox News, conservative media gave them a lot of coverage. So then they grew. So they grew naturally. But if the Koch brothers and others hadn't put millions and millions of dollars into the Tea Party initially on the inception stage, it never would have grown. Conversely, if you look at in 2016, a gentleman by the name of Jeb Bush ran for president, right? I'm pretty sure he raised about $200 million, literally 200 million. And everybody knew who Jeb Bush was, but I think he got about 2%, right? So the money made sure that people knew who he was, but it doesn't get you the votes. So my point being that all of these protests that we do, everything we do, is not advancing a cause that would not otherwise fly. It's basically it's a catalyst for action. It's not manipulating perception. I guess that's my opinion.
No, agreed. And again, there's so many examples in the UK. And I'm sure it's the same as US. You have so many protests where mass numbers and they lead to absolutely nothing and nothing comes from it. So there's no, just like you can spend lots of money on TV ads or other advertisements and you get nothing back for it. So you have to obviously um, back it up. So in terms of with your business now, where do you get greater scrutiny from at the moment? Is it more from the right, more from the left? Is it just both irrelevant? Where's, if you like, the greatest amount of scrutiny you tend to get?
I think it varies over time. I've definitely gotten scrutiny from both, but I have friends on both sides and we work with both sides, and not ever on the same issue. But as an independent, I will say sometimes the right is right, sometimes the left is right. And I think neither side deserves complete power. So I like to um run campaigns that try to push back when one party has too much control, right? Um so I mean I've definitely gotten my share of crap from both sides, and but it doesn't phase me too much uh because it just doesn't bother me. I don't think you can be in this field and get phased by kind of just ridiculous unfair criticism. I think you wouldn't last very long.
I mean, so what's the state of protesting currently in the US? Is there are we seeing more and more protests in the US in the last few years? Has it declined? I
I
can't.
think it's
Is it going up? I'm guessing post-COVID it's gone up, or is it what's the general statistics?
Yeah, well, of course you had a lot. Well, there are a couple of challenges with protests. I'll go over that first. Number one is you have a challenge where there are these sort of radicals who kind of infiltrate protests on the right and the left, particularly ones where kind of people are very vociferous and it's already going to get a little bit tense. So it's a major threat to any peaceful protester because if you're standing holding a sign and there's a guy next to you throwing a Molotov cocktail, how are the authorities going to distinguish who's holding the sign and who's throwing the Molotov cocktail? So there is this kind of increasing concern about that. And in my business, what we try to do is stay away from the types of events that are going to be infiltrated by people like that because I don't want to put people in that situation. So that's number one. I
How
think
would you, sorry, just sorry to cut you off. How would you know that's going to happen? Because it must be really hard to realize that kind of profile of person is just going to turn up. Do you have?
Sunil, I've been in this business so long, I know the type of things where these people turn up, you know.
Okay.
Um, anything where, I mean, for example, like the ICE stuff, the immigration stuff, like where anything where there's sort of a major kind of event going on, and especially toward the evening. What happens sometimes is you have a peaceful demonstration during the day and then it gets overtaken later on. So again, part of it is
Okay.
using the judgment of 13 years in this business to be like, hey, this is something we feel comfortable engaging with, and this is something that I think is going to get heated. And again, are we going to get it right 100% of the time? No. But I think I generally have a sense of this is the type of thing that'll get heated. Plus, you can look online and on social media. We have ways to kind of see what these wackos are thinking, so we can kind of get in front of that, so so we're not surprised by that. In some cases, when we do turn up in those things and we have no choice, we'll engage a security firm to protect our folks as well. So again, that's not common, but it does happen. Um, in regards to protesting, though, I think broadly, though, protesting kind of goes up and down, it ebbs and flows. And the reality is, the reason is people get animated about issue, but then I think there's also a sort of nihilism that takes place. I think in the aftermath of Trump's election in 2024, there's sort of was a bit of a nihilism on the left of kind of like, well, what really matters, are we really like, what's the point of all of this, right? We turn out and he still wins. So I think there's sort of a recalibration um on the left. I think on the left they have to decide because I think you have people who are kind of focused on getting in the streets all the time. And then there are others who are kind of focused on, hey, let's govern and let's actually try to show that we can do a better job and try to be the alternative to Trump. So, um, my advice is I think protest is an extremely effective strategy, but I think you have to consider protesters as ambassadors for your movement. And a lot of times when you have protests, the protesters are actually the opposite of an ambassador for your movement. If someone's blocking the street, if they're uninformed, if they're rude and they're swearing, vulgar, right? Who are you going to convince? My only kind of question that I always ask to in anything is like, who are you trying to convince? Right. So much of protest is sort of self-masturbatory. It's basically like, let's galvanize our people and let's kind of come together, but it doesn't actually help anything. So my feeling is if your protest should be to raise awareness and have people think about the issue in a different way. So if you're doing an anti-Trump protest, right, how are you going to reach somebody who may have voted for Trump but wasn't enthusiastic about it? How are you going to get them to rethink their views? And most of what I've seen does not fall into that category.
I think it's really fascinating just hearing you talk about this because what springs to mind, you probably won't be aware of them being in the US, or maybe you Just Stop Oil, that they're very big in the
Oh
UK.
yeah, this is like the Extinction Rebellion people, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly the
Yeah.
same
Oh
profile.
yeah, those guys are very effective at what they do, but they do break the law.
Yep.
So they're very effective protesters. I mean, like on one level, they are media strategists, right? They know how to get media attention, but it does feel that they antagonize people who actually generally support what they're doing, like who support
100%.
their general thesis.
I think that is the big problem in the UK that people have with that group. I know so many people who are conscious of the climate, worried about the climate, but groups like that completely turn them off. There's really examples of them blocking streets for like in front of hospitals. And so like there's a really iconic video in the UK where there's this tiny small woman who's just basically dragged uh, this just man off the street because she's trying to get to the hospital, and it's just really I think they could almost do with you and your company's advice in terms of how to actually like I said, they do amazing in terms of awareness and raising the media attention, but whether it's actually helping their messaging or getting people to support them, I'm really not sure. And it seems what you're kind of alluding to, it seems similar with the anti-Trump stuff because from what I've been listening to in America, there's so many people that necessarily weren't so there's so many people who voted for Trump that just found there was no other alternative rather than definitely they want Trump. Obviously, there are.
Those people. I was just having this discussion with somebody yesterday where it's like you can't call people who voted for Obama racist, right? If you voted for Barack Obama, the first black president, to be president of the United States, the most powerful person in the world, right? You cannot call those people racist, but yet many of those people voted for Trump, right? So how do you reach the people who voted for Obama, right, in 2012 or 2008, right, who are now voting for Trump? I mean, now there's a thesis to say, okay, well, it's the media, it's fake news that these people have completely changed. Well, I think that might be true of some people, but they also might feel, hey, the Democratic Party has gone too far one way. Um, but it's interesting. So I just have another thought about these extinction people, the Just Stop Oil people, because it's very interesting. Because and I'm just going to make their argument for them, which I don't agree with, but they would say that basically this is an existential crisis. So they would say actually the people we are trying to reach are the people like your friends who are climate conscious but aren't doing jack squat about it. They would say these people are actually the most worst offenders because we need to completely overhaul our system and these people are acting like this is like marginal change will help. So if we have to block hospitals, we will do whatever we can to basically get attention to scream about it. Right now, I don't think that works. I think even if I bought into their thesis, I'm not a climate scientist, so I can't comment on that. But even if I bought into their thesis, if they were to hire me to do this, I would I agree with the idea of protesting people on the left and basically saying, "Hey, you're not doing enough. You say you care about climate and yet you drive a car. You care about climate and yet you fly a plane. You know, you're going on holiday on plane, right? You say yet we're doing all these other polluting things." I think that the general thrust of their argument you could make, but when you block streets and hospitals, you're going to actually make those people hostile when what you really want to do is guilt them. If there's one thing that works on liberals, believe me, I'll tell you, it's guilt.
Mm.
Better than screaming at them, if you guilt them, they will do it. Right? So believe me, I've run plenty of left on left campaigns. If you can guilt people on the left, it's much more effective.
What's more effective on the right? Because there is that general, I don't know if it's just in the UK, but there's that general feeling that the left are more emotion based and you can get them by emotion, and typically the conservatives are a bit more on reason. What would be a right wing or more on the right side? How would you uh, do an effective protest for somebody on the right side?
Well, sure. Well, and I don't 100% agree with that premise. I think the right has a lot of emotion driven as well. I think it's the same concept. I think first of all, I always try to take on left from left and right from right. So if you're taking on someone from the right whose base is on the right, you can expose sort of the contradictions of their views. Okay, you're conservative, but where are the tax cuts? Where's the free speech? Where's what are you actually doing on those things? So I think part of it is, like you said, a fact-based thing, but I think there is an emotion um to it as well. It's interesting when you're thinking of a conservative campaign in the UK, because the Conservative Party structure there is such that you have like 100,000 people who ended up voting for the prime minister like twice, 2 or 3 times. Like you had a prime minister who actually never won a national election, which is kind of bizarre, um, in one sense. So I guess what I would say is your average conservative voter in Britain is a little bit different from your average conservative voter in the United States. They share a lot of common threads, but actually, let me expand on this. There's two types of conservatives. There's traditional conservatives, which is let's not make too quick progress. Let's slow down, let's slow things down, let's act slowly, let's act methodically, and let's not change too much. And then there's reactionary conservatives who often want to aggressively roll back what they perceive as change from the left, right? So if you think about your country, right, Thatcherism was reactionary conservatism, right? So Thatcher, when she came to power, the sort of men that she worked with were of the first kind of conservative. They were resistant to change. They generally wanted to they didn't like kind of reforms from the left, but they weren't bold. And Thatcher basically took reactionary conservatism of like, no, we're going to privatize industries. We're going to aggressively do things, right, that will make it harder for the left to actually end up getting their agenda done, right? So that's sort of the difference. And I think that both the Republicans in the United States and the Tories in Britain have the two types of conservatives, and part of coalition building is trying to bring those two groups together. One group that basically is pretty good with the status quo and just doesn't want to change too much, and another group that is really unhappy and wants to roll back perceived change, right? For example, mass deportations would be an example of reactionary conservatism. Like they let in too many people, now we've got to throw them out, versus traditional conservatism of, hey, let's keep the taxes low, let's keep a good business climate, let's not shake things up too much. Um, and of course, in the UK, you have Farage, who's kind of capitalizing on the second group of conservatives who based of reactionary conservatives who feel like the Tories aren't ever going to really be that for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in the UK because there's so many of us who, would identify themselves more on the right, but would say the Conservative Party of the last maybe 5, 10 years has not really been very conservative at all. So I think there's a real feeling of frustration in the UK in terms of what's going on the conservative side of the debate. In the US, what's happening now? Because our news is currently dominated with Israel, Iran, and just generally that whole situation. But there's obviously other things going on. There's a New York mayor election coming up. There's also what are some of the big topics in the US currently? And of course, you can't say where what your company will be doing in terms of future protests. But what's some of the hot topics right now in the UK and sorry, in the US? And where do you envisage potential future protests coming from?
Well,
What
the big
kind of profile?
themes are in protests are within the right. There's a debate right now on international engagement, right, where you have traditional conservatives again, who generally favor sort of the status quo post World War II U.S. kind of approach of we're big in the world stage, we're part of all these organizations, we are we bomb countries that we feel threaten us. Um, and then there's this kind of new group of reactionary conservatives, Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, right, and the like, who basically say, and Steve Bannon I know is a frequent guest to the UK, and they say we actually don't want to engage. This isn't our problem. We're not gonna associate. So there's going to be a big battle between those two groups over the future of U.S. foreign policy in the next few years. And there's there's also going to be what I call horseshoe theory because the traditional conservatives tend to agree with traditional liberals that with the difference being conservatives want a little bit more war and liberals want a little bit more diplomacy, but they generally kind of like America and NATO, America opposing Russia, America being a force in the world, whereas the people on the far left kind of feel like, hey, America is a bad country. We have no legitimacy. So why should we be engaged in the world? And the people on the far right are basically saying, we don't need to engage in the world. We should be tending to our own problems. Right. So you have a little bit of a horseshoe theory where you have people in the middle who kind of agree with one thing and people on the edges who kind of actually agree with each other. So that's one. Um, I think there's going to be a big discussion about the about deportations. And the it's a big hallmark of Trump's agenda. Um, so I'm curious how that's going to definitely play out. Um, I think you're going to have a discussion about freedom of speech and what speech is okay and what speech is not, as we talked about on the earlier. And I think there's people are going to really hash it out of the idea of what role does the government have in facilitating or regulating free speech. Um, I think you're going to have discussions on economic policy too, where again you have a little bit of a horseshoe theory where you have people on the conservative side, traditional conservatives who really are focused on tax cuts, free trade, business climate, versus the more reactionary conservatives who are more focused on tariffs and quote unquote bringing back manufacturing, this sort of fantastical idea that we'll become a manufacturing powerhouse, despite our very high labor costs, which seems hard to believe. But there's going to be that dispute. And I think you're just going to continue to see um Trump. I think the question is, in some cases, Trump benefits from a little bit of this chaos. So he's going to strategically stoke the flames when it suits him. So when he wants to distract from a story that is unfavorable to him, he tends to announce some major policy that that the left really doesn't like, because he knows that the left is going to take to the streets and it's going to get very testy, right? So if you think about the immigration raids, what did that happened right after his spat with Elon Musk, right? And it was basically, okay, let's do these raids. Not to say that he wasn't going to do them, but he no one knows how to troll the left like Donald Trump. So when he wants to distract the left, it's kind of like it's like if you're it's like a bullfighter waving the red flag. It's very, very easy. You just wave the red flag, the bull is going to charge at you, right? It's the same kind of concept. Trump is sort of the master of waving that red flag, and he knows how to antagonize the left. And it's interesting, there's certain voices on the left, like Newsom, the governor of California, who are basically like, let's not engage with everything, right? Because that's what he wants us to do. But the problem is Newsom isn't actually like the person who is in control of that. So you're just going to continue to see that cycle play out. Um, and so I think you're going to have a lot of different back and forths on those issues, but probably a lot of other issues that are I can't even predict.
It is, you're saying all those things. Is Trump in general good for your business? It seems like that kind of profile of person is like ideal for your company in terms of it will give like so much. He obviously has a massive core fan base that's always going to be his core fan base. He is probably the king of trolling. It seems like he's just good for business. Is that fair
I
or?
think it's a mixed. I think it's a mixed blessing, as always. I wouldn't say he's 100% good or 100% bad. Um, he talks about one thing that, I mean, he gives us a lot of kind of publicity because he talks a lot about the concept of paid protesting, but I don't know. I mean, I think he's made my life more difficult in the sense of there's a lot more animosity around protests than there used to be. So, like 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it'd be a lot easier to just sort of do protests without them kind of getting testy. So it kind of costs us a little more to make sure that we create the right kind of environment with protests. So I think it's a mixed blessing. I mean, at this point, we've been under Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump. So this is my fourth president if you kind of count Trump twice. So I mean, it's very hard to say. Um, but the Obama era was probably the easiest because things just weren't so tense in the United States. So I think the demand for our services has definitely gone considerably up over the past this time. But the it's made my job a little harder because protest things are a little more tense, and it didn't used to be so tense when people were protesting, especially in regards to politics.
Do you think that's maybe not necessarily Trump's fault, but more just general the rise of social media in terms of now people being in their echo chambers and uh,
One is a symptom of the other. One is a symptom of the other. Um, I think there are a few inflection points that I would say have kind of increased animosity in the United States, like and the polarization. And the first was Obama's election, actually, the first Obama's election, the sort of and the backlash to him, right? The Tea Party, as I mentioned. But that seems positively PG compared to what we see today. Um, but I think Trump, he really ratcheted things up, made things very personal. But I think Trump was a symptom in one sense of this social media age and the algorithms of social media. Um, but I think Trump is a PR publicity genius, and he was he exploited the sort of division that social media causes to create his movement. And he did so very effectively. Um, so yeah, I mean, the one is a I guess the point is one is a symptom of the other, but division has kind of generally been going up. So under Trump's first term, it went up, right? You had the Women's March, you had the BLM and all of that. Then under Biden, it went up as he called MAGA a threat to democracy and called conservatives domestic terrorists, right? So the sort of this what I've seen over the past several years is a ratcheting up of rhetoric against sort of opposition, which I think is bad, and I condemn it whoever does it. Where there's this, I to me, it's like, okay, it's supposed to be His Majesty's loyal opposition. Like that's supposed to actually mean something. That's what they call it because loyal opposition, not disloyal opposition. We're loyal to the country that we love together. We have different ways of doing it, and I think that level of animosity has definitely increased.
Oh, it's fascinating, and I think your business is really, really interesting, and yeah, it's such a fascinating, fascinating area of field. Conscious of time, so we have like a closing tradition on our show where I always ask the guest for a unpopular opinion that they have that they think should be popular. So it can be something we discussed in the last hour or so, or it can be something completely trivial. But yeah, an unpopular opinion you have that you think should be popular.
Um, People not having sex and dating is the biggest threat to democracy and national security. Um, so let me explain that. And I can speak to United States more specifically. And you tell me if this is similar
Relevant in
across
the
the pond.
UK, definitely.
So you basically have two groups that one group is um not super well educated men, right? Especially those who are unable to find kind of gainful employment. And another group who is highly educated women, right? So men with kind of high school education or less than a college degree, are kind of right wing by 80-90%. Women with a graduate degree are on the left 80-90%, right? Neither of these groups can actually find a mate. And it's a major, major problem because essentially essentially because they will never date each other. That's the problem. Because essentially they're and the fact that both of them are undateable. So you must have heard of the incel movement, right? There's people who say among men that they're involuntarily celibate, right? So these are people who basically are like, if you're a guy, you're making kind of not no money or kind of crap money, um, you're gonna have a tough time finding a woman, right? Particularly someone to settle down with, especially if you're not super like attractive. So what do? You turn to kind of right wing kind of chat forums, all of these kind of incel networks, and it further kind of puts you down the rabbit hole, right? Of like, this is why I can't find someone, right? Because essentially women tend to want someone who is going to support them, right? And men tend to want someone who makes less money than them or at least at the same level, right? So conversely, you have women who are very, very educated, right? But essentially, they also are having trouble finding a guy because essentially educated men can choose from educated women or not educated women, right? There are plenty of wealthy business executives that will marry a cocktail waitress, but it will never go the other way around, right? So then these women are kind of on MSNBC, like what is it? JD Vance said childless cat ladies or whatever. I mean, but that's who he's talking about, right? So the childless cat lady is never going to be the childless cat lady has a lot in common with the male incel, but essentially the male incel is becoming increasingly violent, and agitated. The female overeducated person is becoming increasingly kind of prickly, and both of them, their radicalization and their inability to find a match makes them increasingly less dateable. So the more you get into that stuff, the more you're actually undateable. And then so you have these groups that are just completely divided, and failure to get laid drives people like absolutely wild. I mean, look at all these like whack jobs. The reason they're so wacky is because they're not getting laid, right? And they have this pent up frustration that they that's manipulated, right? So to me, this is a national security crisis, and we have to figure out how to solve it. I don't necessarily have time to get into my opinions on how to solve this problem because I have a few, but um, but it's an existential problem for the United States. But I think it's probably the case in other Western countries too, though I'm less familiar with it.
It's definitely an issue in the UK in terms of for everything you said. It's completely relevant to UK. There's regular talks about it, not regular talks about it, but it is highlighted quite significantly. It's the generation where it's the highest number of men being single, highest number of women being single. It's a really reoccurring theme in the UK. And so yeah, I think a lot of people will agree with a lot of what you said there. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, Adam. It's been amazing speaking to you, and we'll have to do this again sometime.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure being on your program, Sunil, and have a good one.
Thank you. Thank you.